Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we migrated over our selector code from our reducer so that we were able to convert our categories array that we store inside of Redux into the categories map that we use in order to access our categories quickly and efficiently. In this video, though, I'm going to highlight a lot of the new nuances that come with this pattern that we need to think about at every single stage of utilizing all of the tools that we've seen so far with React Redux, as well as Redux in general. So to begin with, if you have been console logging your component throughout this process, you may notice some really weird behavior that is happening inside of your components. And I will aim to demystify all of this alongside getting a deeper understanding of how these hooks work and how you need to think about architecting some of your application. So to start, I want to look at this category component. As we know, the category component takes the category name from the URL parameter, and then it pulls off the categories map from our new selector that will transform the categories array. And then what it does is it runs an effect that will update the products inside that this category uses, which will be an array, depending on when the category itself changes in the URL parameter or when the categories map updates. So there's a couple things I want to do. The first is that I want to console log render/re-rendering component. Now this is important because we need to know when our functional component is being re-rendered. In fact, I'm even going to be more explicit and say category. Render/re-rendering category component. So we know. Then inside, I also want a console.log effect fired calling set products. And what I'm also going to do from here is I want to go into the selector and I'm going to transform this. Make sure that we return back. And inside, I'm going to add another console log. And this is going to say selector fired. Now I'm going to save this code. And when I go into the application, there will be a bunch of new logs and there will be a bunch of orders. And it's going to be flip-flopping between Redux triggered re-renders, our own internal category triggered re-renders. There's going to be a lot and I'm going to walk through it. And please bear in mind that there are going to be a couple jumps we need to make in order to understand all the pieces. So even if not everything makes sense at once, follow along and in the end, it will all make sense. So the first thing we need to do, let's go to our application. I want to go to hats and I'm going to refresh. What we see here is a bunch of different calls fire. First, what we see is selector fired. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move this up above the selector because the selector right now is firing above the console log. And the reason for that is because, of course, useSelector, whenever the code runs top to bottom, when it hits the selector, it's going to call the selector. And we'll see this in action now if I refresh again. We see at first render re-rendering. So this is our initial component getting mounted onto the page. It's rendering. And what it will do is it'll walk through our code, hit the line where it's saying useSelector, and then our selector fires. Then what happens is that our useEffect will run because our useEffect, of course, is listening for category change, which is in the URL parameter, but it's also looking for category map changes. Now, both of these, of course, are initializing for the first time, so our effect will run regardless. So set products get called. When set products gets called, what you'll notice is once again, this selector fires and then the re-render happens here. Now, you might be wondering, Yihua, why is this happening? Shouldn't the re-render happen before the selector fires? You would be correct. The reason this is happening is not actually what you think. This actually has to do with the way that this logger is confusing us. This Redux logger code, the way that it works is that in order for it to show you the next state, it actually needs to update the reducer first. And when the reducer updates, it's actually re-rendering our component. And there's a lot to unpack here that I need to do in order for us to understand this. The key thing I want you to notice is that even though this logger right here is occurring below the re-render and the selector fire, this is actually supposed to be somewhere before this block happens. And I'm going to explain why this is happening because it's a rather nuanced issue. First of all, why is in the first place set current user re-rendering this component? The reason for this is because the root reducer, as I mentioned, whenever root reducer updates any of these reducer values, the entire store object is going to be a new store object. So just like how our reducer, we spread through the existing state. If you think about our category reducer, we spread through the state and then we update the corresponding property. You can kind of see the root reducer doing the same thing for just the reducer that's updating. And then the other ones just retain their old state objects. So while with the set current user, the user reducer is a new object, categories reducer returns the old state object. So the categories reducer object is the same one in memory. The user reducer one is a new one. However, every single time this combine reducers store object is always a new one whenever any of these reducers update. So this is why, despite the fact that current user is the value that's getting set inside the user reducer, our category components selector function is still getting rerun. And the reason for this is because useSelector as a hook is literally hooked into the Redux store. And whenever an action comes in, this will refire. So now, what I want you to take away is just that fact alone, that whenever any action fires, and as long as a reducer updates, it does not matter which part of the reducer you're listening into, every single component that has a useSelector will rerun. Now, whether or not this triggers a re-render is going to be up to how we code out our structure. So this is going to be the first thing we're going to tackle. We're just going to tackle this topic first before we dive into anything else regarding all of these different logs, because I want to clarify and demystify this section. So that's what we'll do in the next video. We are going to talk about our selectors and how to prevent them from retriggering through better understanding of how these selectors work, as well as learning about how we can modify our own middleware so that we avoid this problem where this gets a little confusing, but also more importantly, so that we at least understand why this is happening. So I'll see you in the next video.